In the 1980s, he testified before Congress about the threat of climate change. But he's probably best known for accusing the Bush White House of editing climate-related press releases to make global warming seem less threatening. Today, he remains a vocal critic of the Bush administration while continuing to speak his mind about the dangers that await us if change does not happen soon. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with Professor of Earth and Environmental Science at Columbia University, James Hansen. You know, there's a school of thought out there that says global warming is not happening, that it's just the natural evolution of the planet. How do you face that?
Well, it's become very clear that global warming is happening. There's nobody who really disputes that the world is getting warmer. Temperature has increased about 0.8 of a degree Celsius in the last century, which doesn't sound like much. 3/4 of that has come in just the last 30 years. It's about a 1.5 degree Fahrenheit. But so there's no issue about whether the planet is warming, but the question is that natural or human-made? And that also has become very clear. Now, there are natural fluctuations of climate that occur, and even very large ones on very long time scales. But this is happening now very rapidly, and it's in very good agreement with what we calculate with climate models, given the changes in atmospheric composition that are occurring. And we just know from the Earth's history that anytime you've changed carbon dioxide from 280 to 380 parts per million, that has to have a big effect. And in fact, we know that the full effect has not yet occurred because it takes the system time to respond to a change in atmospheric composition.
Right.
And the impact, we've felt about half of the impact of the changes that have already occurred. And we know that this is the case because we know that the planet is out of energy balance. There's more energy coming in now than there is going out because of the effect of these greenhouse gases which trap the energy that tries to go out. And we can tell this because where is the energy going? Well, the only place it can go is into the ocean. So we measure the temperature of the ocean very precisely, and we see how much the planet is out of balance. So there's about another 5 or 6/10 of a degree Celsius that's in the pipeline. It's going to happen even if we do not add any more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere.
So how much trouble are we in right now? If tomorrow everyone did everything that's suggested to stop the changes that are happening, how much have we already put ourselves in danger?
Well, you know, that's a good question. In fact, if we did tomorrow begin to address this problem, then we could solve the problem, I think, before we pass the critical tipping points in the climate system. The problem is that we're not beginning tomorrow. We're still trying to convince people that we need to make these changes.
I want to stop here, and we'll get more into the science in a minute, but does that drive you kind of crazy that people aren't listening? Do you ever feel like Chicken Little, in a sense, running saying the sky is falling and no one's listening to you?
Well, the reason I've started talking about this again about 2 years ago is that it did become clear that we are getting very close to the tipping points, and yet nothing significant is happening. Now, I think in the last year or so, there's been a lot of attention to the problem, and I think there's a good possibility that we'll begin to take the steps that are needed. But in fact, most of the things that are being talked about do not begin to address the real solutions that are needed. You see, we are now within less than 1 degree of passing some critical tipping points. This year, we're beginning to see a tipping point being passed in the Arctic, where the sea ice is beginning to decrease in the area that it covers. And this is a good example of a tipping point, because the way a tipping point works is there are positive feedbacks in the climate system, and if you pass a point such that these feedbacks begin to come into play, then it takes very little additional forcing in order to have a very big change.
Right.
In the Arctic, it's a case of the white ice decreases in area, so there's more sunlight absorbed by the dark ocean, and that warms the ocean and melts more ice, and we can end up losing all of the ice in the Arctic.
If I understand your studies correctly, too, it won't happen gradually. It's a cumulative effect, so all of a sudden it could happen massively.
Right. So it can, it's a nonlinear process, which means that it can begin to occur very rapidly. And that's the danger. Now, I think we can still save the Arctic, but only if we make substantial changes, not only in slowing down CO2 emissions, but also in reducing the non-CO2 emissions, the methane, the black carbon, the chlorofluorocarbons. It would still be possible to save the Arctic. But the big tipping point is the ice sheet stability. The danger is that we could get enough warming and begin to start the melting processes on the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet and cause those to become unstable and get a situation where it's out of our control. I think we're getting very close to that. I think just looking at the Earth's history, we have to keep additional warming less than about 1 degree Celsius if we want those ice sheets to stay close to their present size.
And for people to understand, if they go away, what happens?
Well,
besides massive flooding.
the last time it was 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now, sea level was about 25 meters higher. That's 80 feet. Now, that wouldn't happen instantly, but we could get several meters of sea level rise in 1 century. In fact, the last time that ice sheets disintegrated was 14,000 years ago. Sea level went up 20 meters in 400 years. So that's 1 meter every 20 years, 5 meters a century. And that would be incredibly disastrous. You know, about 20% of the people in the world live within 25-meter elevation of sea level. So more than 1 billion people would be affected by that kind of sea level rise. And even a fraction of that, a few meters, would affect several 100 million people. So compare that to Katrina, which was a few 100,000 people. You're talking about 1,000 times more people being affected.
Why has this become a politicized issue and isn't just a science issue? Because if you folks as scientists have studied this and this is the results you've come up with, what are we debating? Why was there debate more so in the past than now, but why has this been a problem?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, you know, I feel that I'm a pretty conservative person. I'm from Iowa and I'm an independent. I'm not a Democrat or Republican. But I feel that conservative values should value creation, should value the other species on the planet, and unfortunately, I think that what's happened is the small number of special interests, fossil fuel special interests, have sort of captured an undue influence in Washington. The democratic system is supposed to be one person, one vote, but the way it's been working in Washington, some people have more influence than others, especially the way our campaigns work. They depend upon financial contributions. And as a result, it's difficult to get the kind of actions that are needed to stop this. Because the funny thing is that the things that need to be done actually would be beneficial in the long run. You know, we're going to have to get beyond fossil fuels at some point anyhow.
Right.
And it's to our advantage to get there sooner. So we'll have the technologies and we can sell them to the rest of the world. And we can get back some of the money that we're sending to China now.
See, the part that bothers me about this whole thing is even if there are special interests and there is money behind it and all of that, that our leaders should be looking at it and saying, overall, in time, we need to address these problems. It doesn't matter.
That's exactly right. That's the problem. We don't have the leadership that has the long view. Too often we're looking to the next election.
But they have to be aware of this, correct?
I think they're becoming aware of this. There are many who are aware of it. But still, I think there is undue influence of the special interests.
You've been at this a while, too. Let me jump in here and just say, and so it's not just the current administration. You've seen issues in
that's right.
various administrations.
Yeah, that's right. And even though there's a lot of talk now, the steps that are being talked about are not really sufficient to solve the problem. If we want to solve the problem, 80% of the problem is to stop the building of new coal-fired power plants that do not capture and sequester the CO2. If you look at the amount of carbon in oil, in gas, and in coal, the amount that's in oil is not enough to take us to 450 parts per million. So far, CO2 has increased from 280 to 380 parts per million. And at most, we can let it get to the neighborhood of 450 if we want to avoid getting a different planet. Mm-hmm. Oil cannot take us there, but coal can take us far beyond that. And the thing about oil is it's going to get burned anyhow. We can't tell Russia or Saudi Arabia or other countries not to sell their oil. They're going to do that, and it's going to come out of tailpipes. You can't capture it. But in the case of coal, we could come to the decision that we're only going to use this at power plants, and we will capture the CO2 and sequester it. If we did that, that's 80% of the solution. We would have to phase out, by the middle of the century, we would have to phase out the old technology power plants and replace them with new technology. But that's doable. I mean, compare that to the difficulty of World War II.
So why don't we do it? Is it just money?
It's the role, I believe, primarily of special interest. Now, there was doubt about the science up until recently, but now the science has become very clear, and so it's very hard to deny the science. But there is another thing that's needed. We're going to also have to stretch the supplies of conventional oil and gas until we develop the technologies to replace them. And that means if we use them very quickly, we will get to a point where our addiction to them means that we'll try to squeeze oil out of coal or out of tar shale or out of tar sands. Right. And so to get things moving in the right direction, we need to put a price on carbon emissions, and that price needs to gradually increase. And that, it doesn't need to be a punitive, but it needs to, the business leaders need to see that it's going to be there, and they need to believe that. And they will invest in the development of technologies that will take us to the world beyond fossil fuels. And that's
now we sit here comfortably talking about this in the United States. If we do those changes, and I hear a lot of people talk about China and the rest of the world is causing just as much trouble as we are, but actually you don't see it that way.
Well, now China is passing the United States in emissions of carbon, but we are primarily responsible for the climate change because it is the cumulative emissions over time that determine the climate change. So we are responsible for more than 3 times that of any other country. So we do have some moral obligation. And in fact, if you look at a per capita basis, we're 10 times China. But the thing is, it's actually to our advantage to take the first steps, the way we did in the case of the ozone problem, where we gave China and India 10 years additional. We said, we're going to phase out CFCs, and you'll need to do it within 10 years. And we all signed up to this Montreal Protocol, and then we helped them with the technology, and they did phase out 10 years after us, and we solved the problem. Something analogous to that is needed in the case of the climate problem. And it would work because China will see that they are going to suffer from the climate change even more than we will. They've got a few 100 million people who are living close to sea level. Right. So I think it will not be hard to get them to come along. We will have to help with the technology, but it'll be to our advantage. We need to develop that technology, then we can sell it to them.
Let me ask kind of a silly question at this point. You talk about the water and the sea level and people living by the water. All right, so if they have to move in further, if we have to do that, yes, it's a lot of people, but what does this mean long-term for the planet? And I hate to say it like that, but it's like, we deal with it.
We could deal with it, but it'd be tremendous economic implications, because it's not that sea level is going to suddenly go up this much and then stabilize there.
Right.
If the ice sheets become unstable, they'll take centuries to completely disintegrate, and so we'll have continually rising sea level. That will be a big problem. But that's not the only problem. The one that I worry about at least as much is the impact on species on the planet. A given temperature line is now moving poleward at a rate of about 50 to 60 kilometers per decade, about 35 miles per decade. And it's been doing that now for 30 years. Species can live within certain climatic zones. Mm-hmm. So those at the high latitudes, in effect, we're pushing them off the planet. We're removing the conditions in which they can survive. And likewise, species that live on alpine regions, the temperature line is moving up the mountain. So we're pushing them up the mountain and eventually off the planet. But even in other areas, species are depend upon each other. Some of them can migrate more faster than others. And so as we move these climatic zones, and if we continue on business as usual, the rate of movement of these temperature lines could double by the end of this century. It would undoubtedly result in the extermination of many species on the planet. And in fact, we know from the Earth's history that this has happened before. There were times when there was global warming of several degrees Celsius, and a majority of the species on the planet went extinct. Mm-hmm. And a scientist will say, well, okay, but new species developed. Yeah, but that took hundreds of thousands and millions of years. We can't even think about 1,000 years. That's 30 generations. Yeah. So if we exterminate species, we are leaving a much more desolate planet for our children and grandchildren and any generation that we can think of.
And there is that whole balance of nature, too. As you take species out, they all have a role to play, and so right. It changes. I think I've heard you say that it would be a different planet we would have.
It would be a different planet, physically and especially in terms of the life forms on the planet.
Yeah. Take me back a little bit and talk about when you first started this research and started talking about it. You ran into trouble right from the get-go with it.
Well, yeah. In the 1980s, I testified to Congress a few times, and it got attention. And then the administration at that time didn't like the testimony. So in one case, my testimony was changed by the White House, and when I made that public, I got in a bit of trouble.
How does that happen? It just blows my mind.
This, in many ways, this is the most important point. The problem that we have in solving a problem is problems with our democracy, where it's not working quite the way that our founding fathers intended it to work. Mm-hmm. There are two things in particular that I point out that have had a big impact on this problem. One of them is that the public affairs offices in the science agencies are now under the control of political appointees. And they control what scientific information is given to the public. So I say they've become offices of propaganda. Mm-hmm. And it's not the professionals at the given installations, at the given centers will tend to be professionals, but at the headquarters level, you have these political appointees, and they control what gets out. And the whole idea of a democracy is that you have a educated, well-informed, and honestly informed public. And so it becomes hard for it to work in that case. The other thing is, I don't understand why, when a scientist testifies to Congress, his testimony goes through the White House. It doesn't make sense.
Was it ever explained to you why?
Well, yeah. The argument was the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, needs to look at it to make sure that it's consistent with the administration's budget. Well, it doesn't quite make sense.
No, it doesn't. And it's scary when you think about it, too.
Yeah. Now what worries me about this is I testified this year to the committee called Government Reform. It's in the title. The House committee, and I raised both of these points. And, I didn't get a lot of interest in those. It seems to me that Congress should be pushing back, but the executive branch has taken more and more power, and we need to get upset about this, because that's not the way a democracy is supposed to work.
When did you first get upset about it?
First in the 1980s, and then, I complained publicly about it, and I made it clear, and then I decided, but my main interest is in science, in the climate science, and I decided to get out of the public eye and just work on the science. And only in the last 2 or 3 years I've started speaking out again, because I realized that we're getting so close to these tipping points in the climate system. We can't afford to let this argument go on for another 10 or 20 years, because it'll be too late then.
When you went back into the science again, though, I have to feel there was some sense of defeat if you're working on information.
No, on the contrary.
Really?
I thought that the public discussion in the late 1980s really got a lot of attention to this matter, and it was amazing how fast it seemed to be going toward impacting the policies. But the Kyoto Protocol was the mechanism that it was going to affect the policies.
Right.
And that, unfortunately, the United States decided not to participate, and that meant that it just wasn't very effective.
Were there ever those moments, though, where you think, I'm doing this work, I'm bringing this scientific information, these answers to the table, and somebody else can just decide whether or not people know about it?
Well, yeah, that's a problem. Now, scientists are only supposed to bring the information to the table, and then the public, via the elected officials, should make the decisions whether they want to change their course. And so I have no objection to that, but I do have objection if we're not able to make that information clear, and that's why a couple of times I spoke out on that.
True or false, if this interview had been a few years back, we would have had a NASA representative sitting in here with you?
Well, that was supposed to be the way it's supposed to work, and I've ignored that sometimes, but that's still the way it is in several science agencies.
Is it for
I
fear
understand that it's
they'll
still
say
that
something?
way.
I mean, why? What is the purpose for that?
Well, the stated purpose is to protect the scientist. But if you want to buy that, then I've got a bridge that I'll sell you very cheap in New York.
Well, and I have to say, the part of this whole thing that, as we've talked about throughout here, is that we entrust you to go and look for these answers. We put taxpayers' money into the work that these scientists are doing, and we let you go, and we believe enough in you to give you the power to do the work. And yet then if the results come back with what we don't agree with, then we can say no. I saw a document that I do believe it was 60 Minutes had gotten a hold of, where they had crossed things out and changed words and all that, which was more than just grammatically changing it. It was changing the whole intent of it.
Right.
And it frightens, it upsets me. It makes me say, well, if a doctor says take this pill, we don't have to have other people vote on it. We assume the doctor knows the pill will help us. But they're not following that through with the scientists, especially in this area.
Yeah, I think decision-making should be informed with the best science rather than try to make the science fit prior policies.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what is happening in a number of cases.
So what do we do now as people? How do we make sure that the information is getting out to us accurately?
I think we have to make the democratic process work. And I think we can do that. And I think it's, in the case of the climate change, it's an urgent thing where, I would like to say, let's go back and fix these processes in the system where we change the public affairs and the reporting requirements. But it's so urgent in the climate case that I think people need to ask candidates for office whether they will support the actions that are needed to solve the climate problem. And I've even proposed a specific declaration of stewardship. Ask the candidate, because all of the candidates are now going to say, I believe in global warming and we will take actions. Right. But the question is, will they really take actions that the special interests are trying to oppose? And so the first thing to ask them is, will you support a moratorium on new coal-fired power plants until we have a technology to capture the CO2? That's the most critical requirement. And the second one is, will you support a gradually increasing price on carbon emissions? A fair price. You don't want to hurt the small guy. There are ways to do this which are fair. But it's very hard for any politician to say what sounds like increased taxes. It doesn't need to be, it can be a revenue neutral procedure so that the government doesn't collect any more taxes in total. But you need to ask those kind of questions of the politicians before the next election, because I think we really can't afford to go through 2 or 3 more election cycles before we begin to take the actions.
About 10 years, you say, right? 2016.
We have to be on a different path in 10 years, but that means your policies need to change before that, because it takes time to replace vehicles and other things. So we really need to get actions in the next few years.
Well, I thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, for all the work you've done, and for standing by it, not being silenced when that could have been an option to take. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
James Hansen.
To order a DVD of this or any episode of InnerVIEWS, please visit HoustonPBS.org.